Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Claudia. And I really enjoyed listening to the contributions from Christine and from Belle. I think this is a fantastic event. So I want to talk really about the justice policies that I think need defending and advancing in this National Policy Forum context and beyond. But I also do want to say that the National Policy Forum itself really, I do think needs changing at some point as soon as possible, because although lots of good people do great work as part of the National Policy Forum, making their submissions, and that's important, and working on the National Policy Forum, I think it was invented as a process by Tony Blair really to weaken the power of Labour Party conference. So I do think some democratic reform to our National Policy Forum process is required. But in relation to justice, I think that we can be proud of the justice policies that we developed in the last few years. And public ownership in justice and removing the profit motive is very important indeed. Not that some journalists and the scoffing Tories agreed with us, of course, but they were proven wrong on a number of occasions, most recently with the announcement just the other day about taking probation back into public ownership. We'd been arguing for an end to private prisons. We'd been arguing for an end to the disastrous privatisation of probation that Chris Grayling had been brought in. And some commentators, even on the nominal left, were saying that we were too obsessed with this idea of public sector good, private sector bad. On the contrary, we were facing and are facing a government which generally accepts the neoliberal mantra that it's private sector good, public sector bad. So I was proud that in our manifesto we committed to bringing probation back into public ownership, and I'm proud that we commissioned the very well-respected Lord Ramsbottom to do a report and a review into what a publicly owned probation service would look like under a Labour government. We also made it clear that no ifs, no buts, we believe that the incarceration of human beings for profit was and is immoral. And that's why we supported an end to PFI in prisons, no new private prisons being returned to the public sector, and also an end to those PFI contracts for prison maintenance. And when you look at prisons run, for example, by Sodexo, run, for example, by Serco, you can see it's the same companies that are making money from our public sector. So under the neoliberal model, in justice, as in all else, the state seems to exist to hand out contracts to big corporations. And we've seen, haven't we, as well, that Serco have been granted the test, track and trace contract by the government worth millions and millions of pounds. I do want to touch upon, of course, our policy in relation to widening access to justice. I was proud that we promised to reverse all the Tory cuts to legal aid for early legal help. And that meant bringing back early legal advice for immigration cases, for employment cases, for debt, for mental health cases, and more. We also promised to ensure legal aid for inquests into deaths in state custody and the preparation of judicial review cases. We also promised to establish a root and branch review of the legal aid agency. Crucially, we promised as well a golden era of law centres with a new fund to expand law centres so communities can actually get legal support to fight back against dodgy landlords and fight back against unscrupulous bosses. We also announced a new community lawyer initiative which would fund training contracts so hundreds of lawyers can serve their local areas. And there was a manifesto pledge as well to look at how to give every citizen a constitutional right to justice, because just as health and education should be the rights of every citizen, so a right to justice should be constitutional right of every citizen as well. As I say, we promised to kick the private sector out of our justice system. We promised to end the failing courts reform plans by halting all further court closures and bringing in £100 million emergency funding to help fix crumbling courts. And we also had a manifesto pledge to actually invest in problem-solving courts that tackle the actual root causes of offending. We also supported alternatives to custody, and I think this is very important. It's something that we can be very proud of, and it's something that we need to stick to. As Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, I announced at Labour conference that we would scrap ineffective short prison sentences by introducing a presumption against short prison sentences of less than 6 months for non-violent and non-sexual offences. I also announced we would have action to improve the use of community sentences and funding to plug that shameful gap in the government's funding for the female offender strategy, and that we would, importantly, invest in women's centres to reduce the number of women being jailed. And all these things are policies I think we can be proud of developing and advocating, and all of these things are policies which we should defend and try to take further as well. We also addressed the issue of tackling discrimination in our justice system. A manifesto commitment was there to tackle the shocking overrepresentation of black and minority ethnic children in our youth prisons. More than 50% of the children locked up in our prison system are from black and minority ethnic communities. We have a worse disproportionality in terms of race in our prison system than even the United States of America. We also promised to establish a fully independent review into how our justice system is handling the crime of rape, because women deserve to be able to have confidence in our justice system. And just to be clear, by a full independent review, what I mean is a review of how the crime of rape is handled, right from the first complaint to the police and the authorities, right through to the release of convicted rapists and interactions with the parole board. Crucially, because we believe in justice for working people going forward, but also redressing historical injustices faced by the working class, we also promised action on historic injustices. So we promised to introduce the public accountability law that the brave Hillsborough and Grenfell families had called for, to force officials and private companies to come clean about wrongdoing. We also promised a release of all the papers on the Shrewsbury 24 trials and the 37 camel-led shipyard workers. And of course, a public inquiry into the historical injustice of Orgrave. It was 36 years yesterday since the police riot at Orgrave during the 1984 to 85 miners' strike. And we also promised a public inquiry into the blacklisting of trade unionists. We also supported the struggles of those fighting for justice, including a public inquiry for the family of Zain Bangbola. And all of these things are things we were proud to support. So what we can't have is a return to some of the approach to the justice system under new Labour, whether that be the increased use of private prisons, or whether that be chasing right-wing newspapers in terms of rhetoric on crime and law and order, which might look good on the front page of a right-wing newspaper, but doesn't actually make our communities safer. You know, we want to rehabilitate. We believe in rehabilitation. We believe in turning lives around. And we believe in reducing the number of victims of crime. And putting people in prison for super short sentences doesn't do that. So when it comes to widening access to justice, when it comes to supporting alternatives to custody, when it comes to creating safer prisons, when it comes to kicking the private sector out of our justice system, when it comes to ending the failing courts reform plans, when it comes to tackling discrimination in our justice system, and when it comes to action on historic injustices, we can be proud of the manifesto that together we helped to develop in 2017 and 2019. I think we need to go forward advocating and defending those policies, but also building upon them.